All right, can everybody hear me okay? Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. This is Left Bank Books, Kranzberg Arts Foundation, and Grey Wolf Press presents Washington University professor and novelist Kathryn Davis, who will discuss her first work of nonfiction, Aurelia, a memoir. Tonight's event is only possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into your local community. It helps us keep our bookstore open, and it helps keep your streets paved, your libraries funded, your parks free, and the many other amazing things that make St. Louis a better place. So thank you. For the virtual audience, if you can hear me okay as well, you can interact with the event by typing in questions as a comment. We'll have somebody monitoring that, so feel free to join in our audience Q&A towards the end of the event. So I'm Erin, I'm a bookseller at Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with our fantastic team here in St. Louis. We're so happy to be doing more in-person events this April and May. So we'll still be producing virtual events for those of you who prefer to watch from home. We'll be doing hybrid events such as this. Be sure to check out our event calendar on our website, which is left-bank.com, for a full list of our programming for readers of all ages. Of particular note, you might be interested in our virtual book launch for Dana Levin's new book of poetry. She will also be here in person at the Hilo on April 23rd with Paul Tran. And additionally, WashU professor Jiro Asim will be celebrating his paperback release at the Heavy Anchor on May 10th. His band Baby Got Back Talk is flying in from New York City after a concert for the paperback party. So about tonight's book. An eerily dreamlike memoir and the first work of nonfiction by one of our most inventive novelists. Aurelia begins on a boat. The author, 16 years old, is traveling to Europe at an age when one can try on persona-like dresses. She has the confidence of a teenager cultivating her earliest obsessions, Woolf, Durrell, and Bergman, sure of her maturity, sure of the life that awaits her. Soon she finds herself in a Greece far drearier than the Greece of fantasy, climbing up and down the steep paths every morning with the real old women looking for kindling. Kathryn Davis's hypnotic new book is a meditation on the way imagination shapes life and how life, as it moves forward, shapes meditation. At its center is the death of her husband, Eric. The book unfolds as a study of their marriage, its deep joys and stinging frustrations. It is also a book about time, the inexorable events that determine beginnings and ends. The preoccupations that mark Davis's fiction are recognizable here. Fateful voyages, an intense sense of place, the unexpected union of the magical and the real, but the vehicle itself is utterly new. Aurelia explodes the conventional bounds of memoir. It is an astonishing accomplishment. And then we have a quote from Sigrid Nunez. As a fan of her novels, I knew what to expect from Kathryn Davis. The beautiful prose, the depth of thought, the originality, the wit, but I was not prepared to be as moved as I was reading her intensely poignant memoir. She has a gift for writing about the most difficult subjects with honesty, precision, and grace. And though much of it is heartbreaking, Aurelia made me rejoice. Kathryn Davis is the author of 6 novels. She has received the Kafka Prize, the Morton Dauwen Zabel Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Lannan Foundation Literary Award. She teaches at Washington University and lives in Vermont and St. Louis, Missouri. Tonight, Kathryn Davis will be in conversation with David Schuman, director of the MFA program at Washington University in St. Louis. So on behalf of Left Bank Books, the Kranzberg Arts Foundation, and Grey Wolf Press, please help me warmly welcoming our guests for this evening.
So I guess I am going to begin by reading, right? That's the plan. I'm going to read a chapter from the memoir. It's not, can you hear me okay? Is this where it's supposed to be? It's a short chapter. And it doesn't really matter where it comes in the book, I think. The way the book is constructed, it could sort of be anywhere. This is called Vigilance. It began as a joke. My husband was dying. He had only so much time left, how much we didn't know. His spirits were generally good, and the shingles virus that made his last days miserable had yet to emerge from its hiding place deep in his body, meaning we could still share the same bed and spend our mornings side by side drinking coffee and looking at the local paper, all 10 pages of it. Personal details about your private life are made public today, my husband said, reading the horoscope. Meanwhile, you need more sleep. The bedroom has 4 large windows facing east, direction of the rising sun, the waxing moon, rabbit, air, redemption. The way the house is situated on a small rise above the street, what you see out the bedroom windows are the branches of locust trees framing pieces of sky shaped like jigsaw puzzle pieces, the kind I had as a girl, where some pieces are shaped like things, a horn, a bicycle wheel, a bird, a shoe. My favorite showed a scene with birds standing one-legged in a marsh at sunset, the sun sending all sorts of colors across the black water. It made no sense for a high-heeled shoe to be there. This is what I was thinking while my dying husband read me my horoscope. And the wind, and the drops of rain like bullets. Gross morn, the final pitch, a sheer wall of scree, and there it was at the foot of the wall, dropped on the talus, a red high-heeled shoe. It hardly makes sense to think about how it got there, or how I did for that matter. I was a girl who constructed forts out of bed sheets in the living room. That was as close as I came to a tent. And my idea of mountains came from a movie I saw on our tiny black and white television screen about men climbing the Matterhorn. The Matterhorn had a pointed top exactly like the mountains we were taught to draw in school. It shook you off like lice, an old woman pointed out to the climbers after the avalanche chased them back down to the village. It was at about this time that my friend Alex and his wife bought a house in The Hague, a charming brick row house with a balcony and chimney pots. And when I showed my husband the picture, he said it made him sad that after all the money and work we put into our house, and he enumerated bookshelves, stone walls, bookshelves, walls, shelves, shelves. For over the years, we'd come to own many books we were loath to part with, most recently, my husband's complete collection of Rex Stout mysteries, a talismanic obsession that had grown in tandem with the cancer. After all that, my husband said, not to mention the tortured beach out front, a baby when we planted it, and just think of it now, casting its tortuous shadow far and wide across the lawn. How could he dream of leaving? He stared at me intently, the dark brown of his irises more transparent, like he was letting me see inside his head. Inside my husband's head was an idea, and the idea had its origins in his background as an ecological economist. Limitless growth is bad. Processes that involve the transfer or conversion of energy are irreversible. Ruth says the city's infrastructure is in worse shape than I am, my husband went on to say. Though by this time he'd stopped joining me on the daily dog walk in Hubbard Park. Until recently, he'd managed to maintain the ritual by taking a shortcut that up the steep hill through a lichen-shrouded ravine. We would find him sitting in the sun on a table in the 7 fireplaces picnic area, of which I've never been able to count more than 5, the dogs having raced ahead of us sitting at his feet, staring up at him, our Lucy and Susan's Riley and Betty's Walnut and Ruth's little Maya. It was simple enough to conflate Ruth's view of our sewer system with the occult data on the discs routinely handed to us by the good-natured medical personnel whose job it was to keep track of the story unfolding inside my husband's organs. There was a narrative involved that didn't follow conventional rules, unlike those governing Rex Stout, just as the work being done in the sewer system, the road torn up every day, and the rubble dumped back in at night seemed like the project of insane elves. But you don't have to leave the house, I said. You could haunt it. The imperative to be vigilant is always there. It's only that there are times in the life of a person or the world when it seems more crucial, just as there are limits to what vigilance can achieve. At some point during the election year of 1956, my father gave me a beautiful glossy sticker that said, "I like Ike." I affixed it to the center of the top drawer of my maple dresser, knowing as I did so that in our family, to put a sticker on a piece of furniture was akin to putting a sticker on my little sister. "I can't believe you did that," my mother said. Shortly thereafter, she gave me a beautiful glossy sticker that said, "Madly for Adley." I was 10 years old. I had written a get well card to Eisenhower a year earlier when he had a heart attack, and to my amazement, I'd gotten a thank you card back that my best friend Peggy's older brother Marto said hadn't actually been signed by Mamie Eisenhower. "That's just printed on," Marto said. I still have the maple dresser and the maple bed. The bed has tooth marks along the headboard where I chewed on it when I couldn't sleep. In 1956, my job was to keep vigil over the night sky for the plane that was carrying the bomb that was going to turn us all to bone and then to ash and then to nothing. The dresser sat across from the bed and next to the console radio set to 1190 AM, WOWO, Fort Wayne, Indiana, the voice of 1,000 main streets that somehow managed to be everywhere all at once, all night long. My job was to listen to the radio whenever I heard a siren, making sure the world wasn't about to end. For many years, the two stickers coexisted on the dresser drawer, Ike in the center and Adley to the left. At night, while I kept vigil, they were companions to me, their twin presence reassuring, the eyes of a single deity lit by the light of the 23 trolley as it made its way up and down Germantown Avenue. Nowadays, the dresser is on the 3rd floor in my daughter's old bedroom, a place where things get put on their way to the yard sale. Considering its age, the dresser's overall finish is in good shape, the top drawer noticeably scuffed in the area between the drawer pulls, where at some point I scraped off the stickers. What was I thinking? I no longer needed them? By the time I was the girl in the tent in the rain at the foot of Gross Morn, I had traded vigilance for romance. I had done some traveling, yes, but always to places where a person stayed in a building of some kind and slept in a bed, even if on a damp Greek mattress. In the house where I grew up, furniture was coin of the realm. All our furniture had names: highboy, bachelor chest, pie crust table. I had never courted danger, whereas my old boyfriend was scornful of trail markers. Like the hero of The Challenge, the 1938 movie about the first ascent of the Matterhorn that I'd watched sitting in the wing chair in the family living room on Wooddale Road, he always preferred to take the impossible route to the summit and execute the endeavor, even if it was doomed, with style. I never imagined myself atop a mountain in Newfoundland, but then I didn't imagine myself in bed with a dying husband either. In the Bardo, narrative seems to happen but doesn't. You think you were making a tuna sandwich. You think you are cutting the tuna sandwich into little squares to tempt your dying husband's appetite. We're born into the life bardo, and when we begin to die, we're in the dying bardo, and after that, we're in the death bardo, at which point we make our transition back via rebirth into the birth bardo, having experienced delight in the meeting between sperm and ovum, and from that state of bliss, fainting into unconsciousness, and as time passes, coming to maturity in the womb until finally, emerging from the womb and opening our eyes, we will have turned into a puppy or something and are back once again in the life bardo. The idea is you are not supposed to encourage a dead person to stay with you. You are not supposed to encourage a haunting, to cause someone you love to get stuck here in this most insufferable of the bardos. Oh, you with your mind far away, thinking that death will not come, entranced by the pointless activities of this life. If you were to return empty-handed now, would not your life's purpose have been utterly confused? So the Lama is instructed to address the deceased person in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, urging him to move on. Oh, name of the deceased, listen carefully. Oh, Eric, listen carefully. Afterward, I found the bookmark he left in the Rex Stout mystery midway through the book. The sentence, the bag slipped from her hand to the floor and her face went white and stiff at the top of the page. I thought of Eric's dark brown eyes moving across the page and then growing tired, the vitreous humor, and then the road bent left. I had seen people turn pale before, but I had never seen blood leave skin so thoroughly and so fast, the book went on to say. I dreamed I was picking red flowers. To the right, a large tree of some kind beginning to leaf out. One gray asbestos wall of the general store visible behind it. We had just met. By summer, the green Valvoline advertisement no longer in view. The eyes staring fixedly without blinking. The scaling of the mountain of the elements. Place the wrist at the point between the eyebrows. The arm so thin as to be a line, and then it was gone. Thank you.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Thanks, Steve.
And thanks for having me. This is my second time getting to be an interlocutor. This in the last year. The first time was with Joy Williams, and now with you. So it's like a banner year for me to get to talk to two writers I so admire. Although I think when I first heard the term interlocutor, I thought I would need a machine. Like it just sounds like that kind of word. I wanted to start with just a question about the genesis of the book, which I know, and maybe not everyone here does, that it wound up a very different sort of book than what you'd first set out to write, which was a craft book about transitions in fiction. And for me, it sort of remains a craft book in a strange way, because I feel like I've learned from it, although I've not learned anything that I feel I could actually do. But I do want to ask about what happened along the way, and when the book started to turn from being what you'd originally started out to write, and why, and what that felt like to you as you turned toward memoir and even away from fiction, which is where you usually reside.
Although there's a lot of fiction in here, I will say. I started out writing. I started out writing a book for Grey Wolf. My publisher has a series called The Art of, and I was writing The Art of Transition. And I I thought it would be an interesting project, even though I had never written an extended work of nonfiction, because I felt like my writing depended more on transition than anything to be fiction in a way, to move, like transition was essential. And I was also really interested in transition as it played a role in music and in film. Sort of any of the art forms that involve time being my favorite topic. And so I started writing this. It was sort of against my better judgment in a way, but I realized that I was interested, but I was mostly interested when whatever I was writing, for example, about Virginia Woolf and To the Lighthouse, I was writing about the great transitional chapter, Time Passes, but I was talking about how I had first come to read To the Lighthouse. And I realized that those more autobiographical moments were of great interest to me, maybe more even than, Virginia Woolf. But I was taking note of that, continuing to write. And then I wrote a chapter that ended up being the final chapter of the book, though at the time I didn't realize that. And I thought it was different in some way, and I thought it might be something that could function on its own. So I had sent it to my agent, who I trust very much as a reader, and to my friend, who I always show my work to also. And both of them said, this is a completely different book. You're really not writing a craft book. This is, they didn't say memoir because they knew I wouldn't like that idea. But it's a different book. And then at that moment, I could look back at what I had already written and see in it the seeds of what this book turned into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then it was exciting.
Yeah, and it was cool that you didn't turn in the craft book, I guess.
No, they were nice about it.
That was good. So I want to ask about one of the epigraphs at the beginning of the book, and this is kind of a two-part question. So, and both answers I think will be semi-long answers, because and I'll just read. At the beginning of the book are two epigraphs, one by Miguel Morales, and I'll read his, which is, quote, "There is no other way to understand the procession of dachshunds that follows Kathryn's disastrous recital than as a looking glass into Kathryn's tempestuous soul. If we were to translate her soul into words, it would say, 'Look at me. No, don't look at me. Look at those dogs instead.'" So the first part of this question is, I know this quote has something to do with a course you teach at WashU on the novel, and specifically with this exercise that's called the Faux Novel. And so I wanted to ask about that. And I will say that this course at WashU is the place where many published novels have their first have their first draft. So a lot of our students have come out of the program with novels that they'll go on to publish that they started in Kathryn's class. So it's kind of an amazing course. And I know you approach it in a really unique way. And I kind of wanted to just ask you a little bit about that, where that quote came from and why you chose it.
Well, dachshunds.
Yeah.
The course, which some of you are very familiar with, the Faux Novel, is a part of the novel workshop. And so everybody in the novel workshop is working on a novel that they want to be working on. But then at the same time, there's the sort of part 3 of the workshop time we spend looking at these faux novels. And everybody, for the very first meeting, brings in a title and 10 chapter headings of a novel that they're not allowed to think about. You're not allowed to plan. It just comes out of your head. You write it down, sort of not exactly gibberish. And one chapter you bring to the first meeting, then they're all 3 pages long, they're short. And so these get written throughout the course of the semester, and toward the end, I have everybody take names out of a hat, and they have to write a synopsis of someone else's faux novel. And Miguel got me, I always do this along with everybody, and he wrote the most amazing synopsis of my faux novel that year, which was called When I Was Beethoven. And that passage that I used as an epigraph came from his faux novel. And I love it so much.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And it seemed to me to be a perfect, description of the way I feel about myself in a work like this, which is supposedly about myself. And yet I feel like what I'm saying is, don't look at me, look at the dachshunds.
Yeah, well, that's the second part of this question, because I thought of it as a sort of a useful guide to reading the book, which offers us a lot of dogs to look at, and as well as landscapes and other writers and composers and religions and philosophies. So we're looking at all that and not looking too directly at the life or the narrative that we might expect from a book like this. So I at the same time as your book came out, another book came out by the writer Amy Bloom, which was also one might describe as like a grief narrative. It was about the loss of her husband, and both books were being reviewed at the same time. And so I was thinking about them both. I haven't read Amy Bloom's book, but I was thinking about them both and about how different your book, I imagine, is in the way that it doesn't allow us to look, completely at you or the story you're telling about Eric. And in some, I haven't counted it or added it up, but it seems like that story, at least on the page, does not occupy all that much of the book, although it sort of resonates into so many of the other things that you are writing about. So I wonder if you could talk a little about sort of the memoir aspect of this, or the not fiction aspect of this, and the choice you made to avoid a kind of, for lack of a better word, like a grief narrative, and instead, what were you trying to do?
Well, I guess I wanted more than anything to, once I realized what I was doing, I wanted more than anything to be thinking about and talking about what exactly it means to live a life. And just, here I am, old, and I've lived a bunch of a life, and then there was my husband who had lived a whole of a life, and the subject just really interests me, and it always has. It's not as if it came to interest me just recently. I am always interested in that question, and the question of, what on earth is consciousness, what is it that we carry with us, that continues in some way, or that we pick up pieces of? I don't know. That's what I was interested in thinking about. And so I was certainly interested in talking about my life with my husband, but I wasn't interested in writing, a grief memoir. I didn't feel like what I wanted to talk about was grieving. I wanted to talk about something that was more alive, I guess. And my experience, reading reading the book, if you read the book, you will see that my experience with my husband and my husband's dying and death because he was a very unusual person and very open about what was going on with himself during this process. And we had quite a long time together. So it wasn't the horrible kind of thing that sometimes happens where you are blindsided by the loss of someone. That did not happen. And so in a way, I felt like it was not just lucky is a bad word to use, but in fact, we had the good fortune of time to find things out together. And I wanted to communicate some of that.
Yeah. I don't want to give away my favorite line in the book because it comes at the very end, but I read it again today, and it takes place when you're sort of like remembering being on the deck of a ship, and then the age you were and the age that your husband was at that time, and this sort of consideration of yourselves when you didn't know him. And in some ways, the book seems to play with this sort of like the vast significance of things, but also the vast insignificance of things at the same time, somehow finding both of those things in the same moments that just continuously like astounded me as I read it. So
Thank you.
That's not really a question,
No.
it's just an observation, but
Happy to hear
it's
that.
one of those lines, and it's one of those lines at the end of a book that just suddenly makes everything in the book, even the things I didn't exactly know how to place or what to do with. It's just one of those lines that drew everything into a kind of sense for me, and it's sort of a very, very heartbreaking line too. So read the book, if only to get the prize of that final gut punch of a line.
Reader, I married him.
So I want to ask, just because I'm reading Susan Bernofsky's bio on Robert Walser, and he's not a writer that I've read a ton of, but I've read some of his microprose pieces. But I'm really enjoying the biography, and you bring Walser up in the chapter about dog walking, or called Dog Walk, and Walser had this sort of crazy walking practice. I mean, he would just get up in the morning and walk for 18 miles or something up into the Alps and back. And he wrote a lot of these really short pieces about that. And so I was just happy to see him in the book. But I know that walking and especially dog walking is a big part of your life. And in that chapter, you talk a little bit about it, but I'm just wondering if you could talk about how that fits into your practice, how walking or dog walking fits into your practice as a writer, and if there are other practices and rituals that also inform your work. So I'm thinking about the chapter about Lost, which makes me feel like TV watching is a part of your practice, which makes me feel like I'm also like ahead of the game. Like that's.
I'm not a great big TV watcher, but I adored Lost. Just so much.
Even the end?
Yeah. I was one of the people who didn't get pissed off at any, I was just like, I don't care, it makes no sense. Oh, look, something just exploded over there. Where did they come from? No, which is a little bit like walking. In fact, I hadn't thought of that, but I had a whole chapter that was in the original craft book that did not fit in its entirety at all into this book, but it was called Walking. And so I talked about a number of writers who have written about walking, including Walser, including Beckett, Sebald, where the walk is an important part of the unfolding of something. And I feel like it's very important. Before I was a walker, I was a runner, and the whole business of not being at a desk all the time, but moving in some way, though, where you're not actually having to pay a whole lot of attention. Well, you could fall down, but you're not basically having to pay very much attention to what you're doing as you're walking or as you're running. So something is going on in here, but you're moving through the world and you're feeling air on your face and you're breathing. I feel like that is a really important part of how I work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's just also thinking about Walzer, like, I think, you know, one of the things that, I don't want to say bothers me, but when I read him or even Sebald, it's like, I'm looking for a transition. Like, Walzer's walks are like, you see every single thing, so there is not much of a transition. But in your book, you do make, I mean, you move from one subject to another in a way that does not feel like walking, but feels more like flying or dreaming or thinking to me.
That was what I wanted to write about in that walking chapter that there are elements of it in this book, but it was interesting to me how the writers who write about a walk, and I was also thinking of Beckett in particular, where you almost feel like there's nothing even more so than in Walzer, like it's as if the idea of a transition is just not present.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? Like, what does that mean about the feeling of living without transition?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll ask, because we were talking about it a little bit in the car on the way here, and I think it's an interesting story just about the recording of the book.
Oh.
And I think that might just be interesting for people to hear that you actually made the recording for the memoir and what that was like.
So there's a Blackstone Audible book that you can purchase. And I did the recording of my own book. And when I had first suggested this idea to my agent, she said, you know, they don't like the author to read their own book because they usually aren't very good. But you can audition. So I did. I auditioned to read my book, and I passed the audition, and then I found out that I could do it after I had come here. So I went to a recording studio. I think it's near here somewhere.
Yeah, that's why we started talking.
Yeah, right. And it was just a really very strange experience to actually, it was sort of a tall chair like this in a little room all by myself with a kind of music stand that had a iPad that I could scroll through so you wouldn't hear page noise turning pages. And I had the biggest earphones ever made were on my head. And I have a really little head too, so I was like, and the man from Blackstone was in the earphones while I read. And so you would read, and you would just read until you clearly made some kind of mistake, you stumble, and then the technician who was recording would put his hand up, and we would do something called punching in, where he would get rid of the mistake, and then we'd punch in from that moment without the mistake. And it went, pretty smoothly. Usually I could tell what the problem was, but occasionally he'd put his hand up and I'd say, what? I didn't do anything wrong. And he'd say, I could hear your stomach rumbling.
I really wanted you to tell them about those rules that they gave you, though, because those are some.
Oh yeah, when I arrived, I was supposed to not wear any clothing that was starched. As if do people even wear starched clothing anymore? And no jangling bracelets. And I had to be hydrated, and I had to bring for a snack grapes.
That's the one that I'm really puzzled by. Why grapes? I know you can't
Transportable, I don't know, anyway, it was an adventure, and then after I finished, the man in the headphones said, okay, so now we take this to Blackstone, they're gonna listen to it, they're quality control people, and they're gonna find some errors and you'll have to come back and correct them. But I made no mistakes. So if you want a flawless recording, and I was afraid, I had practiced too, because I have a Philadelphia accent. I don't know if any of you are from Philadelphia and can hear it in my voice, but I had practiced a lot beforehand not to say water, like water, water.
Yeah, you would have sounded like Mayor of Easttown.
yeah, water.
How are we for time? I think maybe we could take some questions from the audience now. Great. So yes, if there are any questions from the audience or from the virtual audience, I guess too, you can yeah. There is one? Sure.
And if you can repeat the question in the microphone.
Okay.
For the audience here online.
Sure.
So Christian Biondi says, my wife's name is Aurelia, so we are excited to read your book. Where does the title come from?
Okay, so Christian Biondi has said that his wife's name is Aurelia, right? I got that part right.
Mm-hmm.
And is excited to read the book. Hopefully, not just because of that, but that is kind of cool. Where does the title come from is the question.
Because it's Aurelia, the accent. The first Aurelia was the name of the student ship that I went to Europe on when I was 16 years old. That seemed to have been the ship everybody went to Europe on at that time. I mean, a lot of you run into people who say, you were on the Aurelia? I don't believe it. So that was something I had mentioned early on but before it became this book, even when I was writing about when I was writing the craft book, I had mentioned the Aurelia. And then Aurelia is the name of a novella by Gerard de Nerval that my friend Alex, who I mentioned, who had the house in The Hague, he had told me that he thought I would like to read that and read it in the context of what I was writing. And it's a novella informed by a very active dream life. That's the short version. And so that's the origin of the title of the book.
Yes.
My name is Nara Bra. Frank Schweiger, who's a friend, describes your writing as you go on as just bringing the space between yourself or your voice and the reader closer and closer and closer and closer together till there's almost like no space. Does that resonate with you? Do you have a sense of that?
That's nice. as long as it doesn't feel, oppressive. I think that I don't want to feel when I'm writing like I'm, orating in any way. So the idea that the sound of the voice would be something close as opposed to a voice making pronouncements, that's pleasing to me to hear that.
Yes, Cora.
I'm wondering, since you hadn't really written in this genre very much before, if anything surprised you about writing this book?
So I'll repeat that from Cora. The question is, since Kathryn has not written much in nonfiction or memoir, if anything about the writing surprised you?
Yeah. I think first of all, it surprised me that was what I was doing. And then once I realized that I was writing more directly about using myself in a more direct way, because as all of you who are writers know, like anything you write is about yourself. So, forget trying to hide, but this was an instance where I was actually making reference to myself, my experience, and something I had always thought I was not particularly interested in doing. What really surprised me was how much I enjoyed doing it once I started doing it. And then I thought, oh, God, you're going to turn into one of those elderly wool gatherers, and I remember the old country store where, but thinking of these things, what was interesting to me, really interesting, was once I started thinking this way, the sorts of memories that would come to me were the ones that had not already been sort of set in stone, the way we have these memories we carry around, right? Oh, like that's the first day of kindergarten, blah, blah, blah. And I was remembering things I hadn't remembered. And that was really exciting because that would send me into places just in my psyche that were unfamiliar. And so I saw the virtue of this kind of a project.
Yeah, Edward.
Thanks, Kathryn. And since you said transitions, that's all I've been able to think about. So could you talk a little bit about the form that the book ended up finding with, it's like a braided essay in chapters, but each braid is a single paragraph and just, no indent flex left with that line in between, and how you found that form and what you liked about it. I mean, it makes me think of Sebald, where like pattern making overtakes the narrative, but I would just love to hear you talk about managing that many transitions.
I feel like the way I think, and just not even when I'm writing, is like a little block of something, and then we leap and we get somewhere else. I think writing the book, I sort of knew immediately that I didn't like the way it looked with indentation. I didn't like the way it looked just sort of in a continuous anything. The farthest thing from my desire would have been to have it look like Sebald. As much as I admire him, I wanted these gaps and spaces, and I liked the way it looked. I felt like the fact that there was space was encouraging to the reader to make a jump along with me.
Can I ask a follow-up question about nonfiction? Because just sort of at the very beginning, you said, well, a lot of it is fiction. And I'm really interested in that sort of gray area between. So can you just talk a little bit about what you meant when you said that? Or were you just kidding?
No. There are 2 chapters in here that I mean, they contain elements of
The ghost
reality, but the Ghost Story 1 and Ghost Story 2,
Mm-hmm.
and they are, in fact, I made them up. Although I want them to sound a lot like they belong in a book of nonfiction.
Yeah.
That was really fun to do, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the things that I really enjoy about thinking about that blurry line is that like speculation and dreams are in fact nonfiction. They actually took place. They're just not reality. So I enjoyed that part of the book.
Well, and they are, so one thing I've mentioned in some of the things I've answered about this book is that one of the wonderful things in my life is my work with this Jungian Buddhist analyst. And, the Jungian belief is to say like real life and dream life. No, it's like waking life and dreaming life equally valid, equally real.
Yeah.
And so, and I feel like I've always sort of felt that way before I discovered that there was a whole, body of inquiry devoted to that way of looking at things. But it does seem to me that they are of equal weight and validity in a way. And so that's another thing. I wanted the book to have the feeling of both sides of that.
Yeah, it does.
Good.
Are there any other questions? Anything online? I don't know how we are for time.
We have 5 minutes.
Okay.
Well, we could stop if nobody has any more questions. Oh.
Yes.
As a fiction writer who's written quite a few things in first person, what was the process of finding a voice for this memoir that didn't sound false?
Although I hope it doesn't sound false. I think the way the first person voice emerged came out of writing the more technical book about transition, which I didn't really enter into much at all in the first person, but was entering into, I was making little tiny forays in. And I think the sound of that voice that I used when I just was saying, the first time I heard about Virginia Woolf, blah, 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 that voice that informed that way was my entrance into the sound of the first person here. And then it expanded some as I got going.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Take a part about it. Funny.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, and I mean, for me reading the book, one thing I have to say, but I think this happens when I read Kathryn's work, is I hear her voice so strongly in the work, and she's one of a few writers, and actually Joy Williams is another one. And I think like Paget Powell is another writer, or Barry Hannah, whose voice I just hear so distinctly. So for me, I just felt like I was listening to Kathryn talk, and it felt very honest to me. But I assume for somebody who doesn't know Kathryn that they wouldn't have that exact experience. But one of the things that I do want to say is that Kathryn is very funny. And Kathryn also wants me to say that Kathryn is very funny. But it's actually true, as you can see. But that's one of the things, too, that came through. I mean, again, that was one of the things that challenged my thinking that this was going to be a sort of serious book or meditation on death. But it kept on being really funny in these surprising ways. And I think that's one of the things I really loved about it.
Thanks.
So there you go. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Really
Thanks
good.
for coming.
So Kathryn's going to be signing books, and they're available for purchase, and the bar is open.
The
Thanks,
bar
everyone.
is low.